Hello, this is Calvin Robinson at Defund the BBC. Today I'm joined by Alex Deane. Alex is an English writer, political commentator, consultant. He's a regular commentator on Sky News. He has a wide-ranging career working for politicians like David Cameron and Tim Collins, serving as their chief of staff during both their periods as Shadow Education Secretary, as well as being the founding director of the Big Brother Watch. His primary role at the moment is Senior Managing Director, Head of UK Public Affairs for FTI Consulting, and having joined the company in 2014. Alex, that is an amazing resume. Thank you very much for joining us at Defund the BBC. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And given you mentioned my employer, I should, of course, stress everything I say is very much in my own personal capacity and not reflecting their views.
Quite right. Now, Alex, you called for the BBC to be dismantled after an uproar over the broadcaster's sneering attitude towards the Union flag. This appears to have been a repeated problem within the corporation, as we've seen. BBC has been pandering towards this woke culture and being ashamed of essentially being British. Who would you say is responsible for this adaptation of woke values?
Well, I know for some people it'll feel like that fuss over the flag and portrait of the Queen, let's not forget, was a little while ago now. And at least in part that's because very few people reported on it. The media likes to circle the wagons and not criticise one another, which I think is actually quite an unhealthy state of affairs. But it's worth reflecting on how much of a fuss that would have been in most other countries, because symbols really matter. And, you know, symbol of your national flag and of your head of state, those things matter. And it's only right, I think, that a minister of the Crown has the flag of the country he represents behind him and a portrait of the head of state on the wall. And it wouldn't be seen as unusual in most countries. And for it to get to the state where, in the end, it's viewed as totally normal by the presenters to laugh and joke at that sort of thing. In answer to your question, the responsibility has to lie at the head of the organisation. It has to lie with its governors. It has to lie with the people responsible for its direction. And I don't particularly blame the relatively new Director General now in post. I blame those who've come before him. I blame those who oversee it. And in part, of course, it's down to the government, which is supposed to regulate and oversee this instrument of what is, in the end, a state broadcaster, and has signally refused to do so. And to be clear, I wouldn't have renewed its charter. I would have not renewed it the last time around. So I thought that we missed a real trick to try and fix the BBC before, and clearly I think the ship has sailed. This is too late now to reform. It's time for the BBC to go.
Yeah. And building on what you've just said, you know, the government could, in theory, abolish the BBC at any time. And this is what Boris Johnson has been told. He's already accused the BBC of having a metropolitan bias. Alex, do you believe Boris Johnson ever would pluck the courage to actually abolish the BBC?
Yeah, I don't know about the at any time part. I think it does make sense if you've renewed a charter to let that charter flow for the period that it's stated to exist for. But would a government have the courage to get rid of the BBC? Yes, I think that facing an institution which is as biased as the one that we see, I think government could and should be willing to go that far. And the reason I say that is that in the end, this is an institution, and it's not particularly left-right, although it is a soft left institution if we're honest. But the biggest difference isn't between left and right politically. It's over cultural issues and topics like Brexit and patriotism and the things we saw over the flag and portrait of the Queen issue that means we're talking to each other today, Calvin. And the reason I look at it like that is that whilst all people involved in politics think that an institution, an organisation like the BBC is a bit biased against them. You know, the Labour Party thinks that it's in favour of the Tories might think it's in favour of the Labour Party. What was unambiguously clear was that this was an institution that hated Brexit. The bias of the BBC really came to true fruition and evidence over something like Brexit, which was, let's remember, not a left-right issue. There were millions of people in our country who habitually vote for the Labour Party, 5 million on polling estimates, and voted to leave the European Union. Not only does that demonstrate that it wasn't a left-right issue, it also demonstrates the extent of the BBC's bias, because we never heard that left-wing voice for Brexit on the BBC. They never chose to allow the fact that the Brexit movement was quite so broad to be reflected. In the end, what they wanted was Farage and nothing but Farage, and not to allow us to see the fact that this thing they hated, that is Brexit, was actually reflected right across our country and was right across classes too. Many working class people believing believing in Brexit as I did. So it was really the Brexit debate and its aftermath that showed to me the extent to which this is, to use your term, a metropolitan bubble containing people who never hear opinions to the contrary, never hear the other point of view, and just thought Brexit was completely wrong and weren't shy about saying such things. I mean, slightly veiled terms sometimes, but it was very clear where the BBC, corporately and through its individuals, stood on things like Brexit. And when you get to that stage, it's time for them to go. And it's time for them to go when they behave like they did over the crown, over the flag, and we had a picture of the Queen issue that we were discussing, because the really telling thing, Calvin, is that those BBC presenters, they can't comprehend why people are upset about it, right? That there are patriotic people who are proud of our country and proud of our flag and proud of our Queen. That's a totally alien worldview for them. And when you get to the point where that is obvious, that that's the truth of your national broadcaster, it's time for it, and it's time for it to go. And the supreme irony of it is they're paid to hold those views at the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Yeah, here. I mean, BBC journalists are constantly being caught out for their blatant bias and anti-Britishness. One BBC journalist in particular was caught tweeting out that the Bristol riots on Sunday were peaceful. However, not long after tweeting it out, deleted it as if nobody would notice. Why do BBC journalists find it so hard to stick to the impartiality rules?
So I think it's because they don't know it, people who hold contrary perspectives. It's remarkably small elite media London bubble that they operate in. And of course, I sympathise a bit with the Director General, who must be tearing his hair out, trying to reform this blob, trying to get them to stop behaving like this. And on the very kind of week that he's launching the next stage in that part of reform, you have these breakfast presenters laughing at a minister because he's got a picture of the Queen on his wall. And then moreover, when off air, liking criticisms of the Conservative Party and of people who fly the flag afterwards. Of course, the presenter concerned then gave a classic non-apology apology. I'm sorry for any offence you felt. I mean, she didn't mean she's sorry, of course. She meant she's sorry she got caught. And she's sorry that she was made to issue a tweet retracting likes which plainly actually reflected her views. The reason they find it so difficult to not show those views, Calvin, is A, because they're part of that bubble and it's just an alien worldview for them to have someone have a different perspective. And B, they have such disdain for anyone who might disagree with them that it just leaks out. They can't hide that. And the remarkable Andrew Neil said that this is an organisation that seems to have forgotten what the first B in its name stands for. It would be fine. I mean, not fine exactly, especially on that riots one you mentioned, but generally speaking, it's fine to hold these views. It'd be fine to be Republicans. It'd be fine to think we shouldn't have the Queen as our head of state if they were an independent broadcaster. And if you hold those views, then I would disagree and we could debate them. But so what? You know, the point is we're compelled to pay for it. It's okay to think like that. It's okay to think like Naga Munchetty does and to act like she does, liking tweets, criticising a particular political party. It's just not okay to do it at the British Broadcasting Corporation. So we should do them a favour. We should liberate them to hold the views they so plainly have. And we should get rid of the BBC so they can be an independent broadcaster like anyone else and say and think what they like.
And as a result of these actions you just mentioned, the BBC's lost an additional 200,000 licence fee payers. And, you know, the big boss, Tim Davie, admits to watching these numbers like a hawk. Tim isn't oblivious to the fact that the BBC faces both a cultural and a political problem at the moment. But what do you think it will take for him to change his ways or to change their ways?
He can't. I mean, it's a labour that's impossible to perform. It's beyond Hercules. Look, the BBC was designed for a time when broadcasting was uniquely expensive and when there wasn't advertising and when equipment had to be produced by the state and it wasn't, you know, in the wherewithal of the private sector to do that anymore at that point. None of those conditions apply any longer. None of the things that gave us the BBC are any more in existence. That's the success of many outlets in commerce show, and most recently as the success of online outlets like your own amply show. We don't need the BBC, and it's impossible to reform it to the standards that you'd need to reach for it to even be acceptable anymore. So they shouldn't try. They should get rid of it. And ultimately, in his new set of reforms, this Director General talks a great deal about diversity. But for all their talk of diversity, they lack diversity of opinion. They all think in the manner that we are describing, And we're never going to succeed in changing that mindset. It's too deeply set in the culture. And once that's the case, we should just realize the inevitable and say the ship has sailed, it's too late, it's time to get rid of the BBC.
It's an interesting point because, as you say, they're spending £100 million on this diversity programme. At the same time, the BBC Director General, Tim Davie, has been pressing ministers to borrow £150 million as a boost to try and compete with Netflix. This, again, is further proof that not only are the BBC extremely out of touch, but also they should now be able to stand on their own 2 feet and enter the free market as a commercial entity rather than a taxpayer-funded organisation.
Sure.
Do you think there's a vital element of arrogance there? And do you think they could compete in a commercial sector?
It's a peculiar mix of arrogance and naivety, because why on earth should a state broadcaster be seeking to compete with Netflix? It should be doing public education. It should be doing niche arts and culture programs that wouldn't otherwise be met. It should be doing world-class news, which obviously it doesn't. And if it stuck to that relatively narrow remit, if it was a kind of PBS American-style public broadcaster, then one would have very little criticism of it. Instead, it's an absolute behemoth that swallows up and challenges everyone else on the pitch, that destroys local news outlets, thriving local independent news outlets by stealing their content, pasting it on its website, and then saying aghast, oh gosh, look, where all the local newspapers have gone. It sends more people than anyone else to any kind of sporting event, as if commercial media couldn't cover sport. It tries to compete with Netflix, even though, of course, Netflix has got greater financial resource than them, and it's absurd to go ratings chasing if you're supposedly a public sector broadcaster. And then what does it do when that kind of challenge reaches the financial inevitability that it does? It always demands more. We've got to have more money, and we're going to get that money at the price of imprisonment for anyone that wants to be able to receive any kind of signal. That's a perverse logic. None of the commercial outlets in the end operate like that. If you don't want to watch a commercial outlet, you don't have to, you can turn it off, and you certainly don't have to pay for it. But if you want to receive any kind of signal in our country for television, you have to pay the BBC. Imagine this in any other context. You go to one of those ticket booths in Leicester Square because you want to see a show, and you say, well, I'd like tickets for Les Mis, please. And they say, all right, but to have tickets for Les Mis, you've got to pay for Cats as well. You say, well, I don't want to pay for Cats. Well, unless you pay for Cats, if you go to see any show, we're going to send you to prison. I mean, this is crazy. This is completely illogical, and it's the ultimate extreme of the absurd attitude we sometimes get in this country, that our system is the only way of doing it, and we can't possibly learn anything from anywhere else. We have that attitude in healthcare. We have that attitude in broadcasting in spades. We say to ourselves, well, how could it possibly be done anywhere else? We're having the same debate, by the way, at the House of Lords, where people still make the arguments about, well, which chamber would possibly be supreme if we had 2 elected chambers, when there are second elected chambers all around the world and no one's willing to make the comparison. There's very good broadcasting in lots of countries all around the world that is produced without the threat of imprisonment. And if you want to test that logic, just talk to anyone from abroad about the insanity that is the license fee and the fact we prosecute people all the time for not paying it. Daft. And people from abroad see it as such. It's only people who live in the UK who seem to think this kind of weird invasion of freedom and restriction of speech is normal or natural.
Perfectly summed up. Alex Deane, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure hearing your views.